All right, I think that we are ready to start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar about the politics of the Biden-Harris administration and the state of the Democratic Party. We will, during this hour, cover a broad range of topics, like the politics of the current administration, the second impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump, and the status of the party. And I would like to encourage all of you viewers of this webinar to send me your questions through the Q&A function here on Zoom, or as comments on the live stream at Facebook, and I will bring up as many as possible during this hour. We are very happy and honored to have today's speakers with us. I would like to warmly welcome Professor Seth Masket, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center on American Politics at the University of Denver, and also Elizabeth Valentin, Founder and CEO of Crimson Clark, a communications and public affairs agency here in Stockholm. My name is Ylva Pettersson, and I work as Program Manager here at the Institute. And I would also like to warmly welcome my colleague and expert on American foreign politics, Professor Jan Hallenberg, who I have asked to set the stage for us. So please, Jan, would you open the webinar for us?
Thank you, Ylva, and thank you, Professor Masket and Elizabeth Valentin for taking part in this webinar. It seems to me that US politics in these days is going through a difficult period. One question I'd like to address to you is, to what an extent is the system reformable? The Democrats now control the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. Will they be able to pass important legislation? COVID-19, of course, the first package, it might go. And then you have a big package on election rights. Then you have environmental issues. And finally, perhaps voting rights. All these things would be important reforms in the US system. Is it possible to pass all of these or some of these? And could you also address the question of the filibuster in the Senate? That is the requirement that there are at least 60 votes for each legislative initiative in the US Senate. Is the US system reformable? If it isn't, what will that mean for the Democratic Party going forward? Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. I will keep those questions for a little bit later, I think, but I will turn to Seth and ask you to please tell us about what sort of politics that we can expect from the Biden-Harris administration.
Hello, thank you so much for having me on this. I really appreciate these questions. So what can we expect? This will, for those who've been following US politics over several years, this will be something of a return to normalcy, quote unquote. The Trump diplomatic approach, the Trump political approach was highly unorthodox in many ways. Biden is a much more seasoned foreign policy expert. It was interesting because foreign policy really didn't come up a lot in last year's presidential campaign, which was largely focused on issues like the economy and the pandemic and other domestic issues. But Joe Biden has a very long history in American politics. He was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He really has more foreign policy experience than really any president, any recent president since George Bush Sr. So I wouldn't, there won't be pressure on foreign officials to interfere in US elections. There won't be demands to purchase Greenland or things like that. What Joe Biden is often described as something of like a liberal internationalist. That is, he tends to favor international agreements and treaties, maintaining relationships with longstanding allies. We could probably expect things to function similarly in many ways to how they functioned during the Obama administration. Notably, President Biden set up what he described in his inaugural address as 4 crises that required attention. There was the economy, the COVID pandemic, white supremacy, and climate change. These were the 4 things he wanted to devote most attention to. In terms of foreign policy, climate change would probably be the biggest of those. And one of the first things he did on his first day in office was sign an executive order bringing the U.S. back into the Paris Climate Agreement. Within the U.S., as Jan noted, Biden and his party have fairly narrow control over American politics. Democrats have a very slim majority in the House. They have the narrowest possible majority in the U.S. Senate. It is truly a 50-50 Senate, with Vice President Kamala Harris breaking ties within the chamber. This is honestly probably a fairly unstable majority that Democrats have. There's a decent chance it won't last 2 years. There's a number of very elderly members of the U.S. Senate. If they were to leave office, a number of them might be replaced by Republicans. That would cost Democrats their majority. So Biden can do a number of things by executive order. He's done a few of those already. These include executive orders on climate change, on immigration policies, and a few other things, mostly undoing some of the executive orders that President Trump enacted. He has some support for some legislative changes that would go through Congress. These include the COVID relief packages that are already going through now. That could end up being worth something like $1.9 trillion pumped into the U.S. economy. There's the appointment of judges, the appointment of Supreme Court justices. He has limited support for some other priorities within Congress, including some more expanded climate policies, an expansion of healthcare insurance, possibly some political reforms, including protection of voter rights. But anything beyond that, it will honestly be very hard for him to keep his coalition together and to keep essentially all 50 Democratic senators on board with further reforms.
Is there anything you want to add to that, Elizabeth, or do you want to comment on how you see this impacting the American society?
Well, I can take a little bit of both. First of all, with this impeachment, nobody is happier than Joe Biden that it's over. I mean, I think a lot of Democrats were obviously very disappointed with the outcome, but that was one happy Democrat, I think, right there, because we can finally focus on what he wants to focus on, which is his agenda, because it has not dominated the conversation at all. And like Seth said, Biden has experience, and we all know his foreign policy experience, but we should also think about his Senate experience. When we talk about getting things done, getting bills passed, you need the Senate. And I can't think, it's been a long time since we've had a president with as much experience from the Senate. He's the ultimate DC insider, the bipartisan deal maker in the Senate. When he returned there, he was like, I'm back home. He invited this was also unprecedented, to invite lawmakers to the White House is a very early move. It's important to him. And the question is, are we going to see that bipartisan deal maker, that skill he's developed through all those years, or are we going to see the president that many in the progressive left want to see, the person that is going to expand their agenda? Which Biden will we see? We don't really know yet. We're getting an idea. A little bit like Seth said, I think there are some areas where we really have a common cause with Republicans, where they could kind of come together. It could be on COVID-related things. It could be infrastructure, higher education, student loans, rural broadband, a similar issue we've actually talked about here in Sweden with that as well. You see the same thing in Sweden with those very issues. Those are issues the parties can come together on. And I think another optimistic thing for Biden is, Pew Research did a poll and they found that 6 out of 10 Americans say, I like how Biden explains his policies and plans. And I think that's so important. I think we've been missing that the last 4 years. Whether you agreed with Trump or not, you weren't always sure why they were doing what they were doing and whose interest this was serving. Biden has been very good about laying out plans. Just the very fact that Seth could quote, what his priorities were, it was very clearly laid out. We didn't even see that with Obama. I used to struggle with that. I used to get asked all the time in my role, I'd be live on TV and suddenly it's like, tell us what Obama has planned and what he's done and what his priorities are. And you could hardly name them. The way now, I think it's very clear what the focus is. And the focus is right now, this passage of this, there's this big 1.9 trillion COVID relief plan. That's the first thing he's going to push right now, or try to push through Congress. And then after that, it's about infrastructure, immigration, criminal justice reform, climate change, healthcare. Those are the issues. But we'll start with this. Obviously, COVID's very much dominating the conversation. So I think with your question there, Ilva, about the impact in American society, right now, American society, it's all about what people are, everyone you ask, poll after poll, survey after survey says people care about economy, COVID, and jobs, which are kind of interrelated. And I think everything he's going to be doing is related to that. I think it's also where he can find common ground. We all want to solve COVID, and COVID, by the way, too, when we come back to foreign policy, that's a foreign policy issue as well, because obviously involves a lot of nations coming together with this. So that's where it is. And I guess what's going to be interesting to see is what Biden will we see in the Senate. Is it the bipartisan deal maker who's willing to compromise, or is it someone who's really going to push the agenda a lot of people in the Democratic Party want to see?
So you both actually see a possibility for the parties to make some reforms and to agree in Congress. Elizabeth. Or Seth, if you want to comment on that.
Okay. Sure, I'll jump in on that. I certainly agree with Elizabeth. This is Biden's skill set. He's very competent at working with people across party lines, at putting together legislative coalitions to get things done. That was one of the main jobs he had as vice president. That that Barack Obama, who did not have a lot of experience in the Senate, essentially relied on Biden to make some of those, to push through some of his legislative priorities. This is, of course, Biden first got into the Senate back in 1973, if I'm not mistaken. That was one of the most bipartisan periods in all of Senate history. And we are now in one of the most partisan periods in all of Senate history. It's a very different Senate today. It's a very different federal government. So I think his ability to work across party lines is compromised. But, as Elizabeth said, basically, if anyone can do it, it's him. So I think there is some chance for him to press some of the sorts of reforms.
We've already touched upon this a little bit, but I wanted to come to the foreign policy aspect of the administration's policies. And I wanted to ask you, what will it mean for a country like Sweden? And a viewer, Ulle, would like to ask you also, given the internal problems in the US, how much time will the new administration give to international issues? Maybe I'll give that to Elizabeth first.
If you had asked me that question a couple of weeks ago, and people did ask me that question then, a lot of my answer had to do with the, and how it impacted Sweden, had to do with the climate change focus. Obviously, he sees it as this existential threat. Having John Kerry be the climate envoy, there's obviously a lot in the Paris Climate Agreement, all that. It's a lot of opportunity for Sweden. Sweden is kind of a green innovation nation. You can see a lot of potential for working together. So that's the sort of optimistic answer. I think we also really need to lift up this whole Buy America thing that Biden has also been pushing, which could affect Sweden in a negative way. This idea of really pushing for that and making this distinction. And this is new. This is so interesting and so new between foreign policy issues and domestic policy issues. And traditionally, when you think domestic policy, like when we talk in campaigns, we often talk domestic policy is that helps the working families. That's what helps the middle class families. We talk about kitchen table issues, pocketbook, wallet issues. We talk about domestic policy. The argument now from Biden's team is that foreign policy should also be working people's issues. When we talk foreign policy, when we make foreign policy decisions, that should help the working families with their lunch pails and their kitchen tables just as much as domestic policies do. So that's why you're seeing this Buy America, helping working families with what our trade policies are. And I think obviously that has huge implications for Sweden. And then the third thing is just that he needs to, we all know this, he needs to repair the damage that has been done with just European relations in general. And that's something that's going to have to happen too.
Seth?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a lot to add on to that, except to just note on Elizabeth's last point, the Trump administration's relationship with Europe and specifically its relationship with Russia were pretty significant departures from longstanding U.S. policy. I would expect Biden to, kind of return to the way things were under Obama and even under Bush and even Reagan to some extent, where there is more resistance to Russian aggression. There's more interest in punishing Russia for its interference in other countries. And there's just more support for longstanding NATO allies. So, to some extent, there'll be a return in that direction. But just overall, and for the person who wrote in, there is a very heavy focus within the U.S. on domestic policy right now. We saw this during the presidential campaign. We see this in a lot of media coverage today. This is, there's just an impression that there's a lot of crises that Americans need to deal with at home, and are just not heavily focused on what's going on abroad at the moment.
And if we then turn to the second impeachment trial that just finished, how would you say it was handled, and what conclusions are being drawn by the Democratic Party? Seth, would you like to start?
Certainly. So this impeachment trial was quite fascinating and honestly quite different from the one that was just a year earlier. The Democratic House managers, that is the members of the House who came over to the Senate to prosecute the case against Donald Trump, they, I think by almost universal agreement, were put together a very compelling case. They were highly skilled prosecutors. They put together overwhelming evidence that Donald Trump had really incited this insurrection on January 6th. And what's one of the more striking things is that there's very little disagreement on that main point. A lot of the disagreement was basically whether to punish Trump for it. The president's lawyers, President Trump's lawyers who were defending him, I think most observers agreed that they were not doing a particularly impressive job. But for one thing, they didn't have a very strong case. They were trying to defend a client who a lot of people saw as very much responsible for what he did, and they were also some of the only lawyers willing to take that job. Not being currently the president, he didn't have the White House counsel's office to draw upon. The president, President Trump had essentially money to spend on lawyers, but there were only so many people who were willing to take up that case. One of the striking results of that trial was that, of course, Donald Trump was acquitted. Under the Constitution, it requires 2/3 of the Senate to actually convict the president. And that has never happened. We've never had that in U.S. history. 7 Republicans joined the Democrats, all the Democrats, in voting to remove Donald Trump. That is by far the most bipartisan vote for presidential removal we've ever had in this country. And it's fairly striking that those 7 Republicans, some of whom represent fairly conservative states, were willing to take that vote. They didn't seem to fear for their political careers. They didn't fear for any pushback from President Trump's supporters. And they seemed very comfortable with making that vote. The other 43 senators, Republican senators who voted to acquit on Donald Trump's side, they were mostly citing technicalities. That is, a few of them felt that Trump was innocent, that they simply said, okay, the president may be responsible, but they didn't feel that the Senate could convict someone who was already out of office. One of the real lessons from this, and I don't know how much the parties are internalizing this, but I think a real lesson here was that functionally Congress has no real power to remove a president. The only time we came close to doing that was with Richard Nixon in 1974. That never actually went through to a full impeachment or trial. He resigned, believing that was inevitable. But that was also at a very weakly partisan era in United States history. For the most part, because it requires 2/3 of the Senate to remove a president, and almost no point in history has a party had 2/3 control of the Senate. That would require a substantial number of the president's of senators of the president's party to actually vote to remove him. And I think if they're not going to do it under the circumstance of the president inciting an insurrection against Congress itself, it's simply not going to happen. Now, I don't know if there's much interest in actually changing the Constitution to make it easier to remove a president. My guess is that probably won't happen anytime soon. But it is, I think, a fairly sobering moment, suggesting that at least while they're in the White House, presidents more or less have impunity or immunity. They can they can largely do what they want, which makes the nomination and selection of presidents obviously all the more important.
Elizabeth, do you want to comment on how it was handled, and also what lessons the party has drawn from this, would you say?
Yeah, and Swedes ask me a lot about this. From the moment Trump became president, it's like, can you impeach him? When can you impeach him? How does impeachment work? And I think there's been this optimism because impeachment exists, that it's easy to do and you just need to do it. And it's really, as we've seen, no matter what the case that you build, no matter what support you have, this is difficult to have work if you want to do it. And timing is everything. I often think with this, it's a little bit like when we think back when Hurricane Katrina happened. That was in September 2005, but it had happened September 2004, and things had gone the way they went for George W. Bush. He might not have been elected again for a second term. And you see this here too. If this storming of the Capitol had happened earlier, where he still had a couple months to go or years to go as president, I think there would just be a difference. I think the thing was sort of, this was wrong, but he's out the door. He's gone anyway. The technicalities of whether you can impeach a former president kind of came into play. What I find encouraging, this is me putting on my Democratic hat, is that 68% of the public say that they don't want Donald Trump to remain a political figure in the US. But that was a couple days ago. You can't trust these numbers, because now what's happening, what it seems to be, and Seth can speak more, I'm sure, to these kind of statistics, but when you look at the polls and how they're moving since impeachment, suddenly you're seeing more and more people where there's support of Trump. Yeah, if he was to run again, maybe he would be interesting. And yeah, whose fault was that? That was the rioters' fault. And that there's sort of a support growing for him. And what will be very interesting, he hasn't spoken up about it yet, but when Trump does speak out about it, will momentum grow? He's been very quiet. Will this be for Democrats, when you ask about the party, will this be the kind of more of a burden than anything? I understand why they wanted to do it, but it sort of opened up sort of a can of worms here, where it might give Trump a stronger support than if we had done what we traditionally do, which is when presidents leave in the US, they get forgotten for years and years, and then maybe have a comeback, but they definitely go through a period of just being sort of taking sort of a timeout, working on their oil paintings or whatever they're doing, and then slowly maybe coming back to public life. But right now, we might have created the situation where Trump doesn't come back very quickly thanks to this impeachment. So
we'll try to look into that next week when we talk about the Republican Party, because these are also very, very interesting questions. But coming back to the Democratic Party, what is the current status of the party? They won presidency and also both chambers of Congress. What is the general status of the party, would you say, Elizabeth?
Well, let's remind ourselves, and this is a big, the expression we use is sort of the big tent party. The Democratic Party has a lot of different ideas and voices in it. And if we make a Swedish comparison, you think about all the Swedish, parties that we have, imagine a party where everything from, Vänsterpartiet, all the way over to Moderaterna, we're all in one party and had to agree on an agenda. And that's the struggle we have, that it is a party of a lot of ideas and a lot of voices. And even before this presidency, they've been struggling for what's their identity. Who are they as a party? Are they an urban party? Because that's what it's sort of turning into with, sort of urban voters. How are they addressing, suburban, rural issues? Is this a progressive left party, or is this sort of a center party? There's that struggle, I think, and I think they're in a relatively good position, given, like you said, the support that they have and the president they have to actually move forward and get things done. But I'm concerned too with with Biden's age and the age of a lot of the other prominent Democrats. The new generation. Where are the if we think 10, 15, 20 years of this party in the future, who will be leading it? Who are the young voices of this party? Where in the US compared to Sweden, in Sweden, we have a lot of younger political leaders. In the US, you're young, if you're maybe 50, it's a little bit of a different system there. So I am kind of wondering, where will it go and who will lead it in this big tent where there's just a lot of different ideas?
Seth, would you comment on that?
Yes,
What is your analysis? Sorry.
Yes, I would agree with what Elizabeth noted there, that there are some very real splits within the Democratic Party. This was the subject of a recent book I wrote, Learning from Loss, which focused on the Democrats between 2016 and 2020, in which there is, you can see sort of Joe Biden kind of representing something of the mainstream, the moderate side of the Democratic Party. And then there's kind of a progressive wing of the party consisting of people like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Elizabeth Warren, and a few others who are trying to move the party in a much more progressive direction. And there are pretty serious policy disagreements between those factions about universal health care, about climate regulations, about election reform, and other things. Now, it was interesting to watch, this is some of the things I was researching included, some of the arguments between these factions focusing on the 2020 presidential nomination. A lot of groups within the Democratic Party didn't necessarily see Joe Biden as their first choice or even their second or third choice, but they largely agreed that he was the most likely to prevail against Donald Trump in the November election. And that seems to be a bet that has paid off. But you saw the progressive wing of the party really being on very good behavior throughout 2020. That is, they largely rallied behind Joe Biden. They were willing to support his ticket, even if they didn't see him as the best candidate for them. But he was willing to work with them on a number of issues. They're also now in a situation, these progressives, that they kind of want something for their efforts. They want Biden to push for various things. Yet they also recognize that in dealing with Congress, Biden is dealing with some very narrow margins, a very limited margin in the House. Again, a 50-50 U.S. Senate. One of the names we're going to be hearing a lot over the next year or two is that of Senator Joe Manchin. He's the Democratic senator in West Virginia. He's by far the most conservative Democrat in the U.S. Senate, which means that almost any legislation that Democrats are able to pass is something that he'll need to approve of. And he won't approve of everything. He's much more conservative than most Democrats. So there will be a lot of negotiating with him, to get him to support things. We could see some very interesting fights among the Democrats in next year's midterm elections, particularly in the Democratic primaries. I think there will be some progressive challengers to a lot of longstanding incumbents. There's also an interesting and I think very perilous situation for Democrats over the next few years, in that they are recognizing a representational problem that they have. That is just due to how people live in the United States and where Democrats live. They tend to live fairly clustered in a number of cities, whereas Republicans are spread out more evenly throughout the country. As a result of that, there tend to be, in district elections, there tend to be a lot of wasted votes among Democrats. And you have a U.S. Senate and an electoral college that are not very friendly to Democrats. Democrats can win the popular vote in a presidential election by 3, 4, even 5 points and still lose the electoral college. We saw that in 2016, where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 3 million votes, and yet Donald Trump still became president. In this most recent election, Joe Biden won by something like 4 percentage points, and still only barely won the presidency thanks to the electoral college. So this simply means Democrats they recognize that they have to coordinate with each other more. They have to be willing to moderate more in order to win nationally. Well, Republicans really don't. So this is making a real difference between the two parties right now, and pose some serious some governing constraints on Democrats going forward.
You both talked about and mentioned the new generation and the need for to look ahead for new Democratic leaders. Is it a momentum for the progressive wing, or would you say that the next person would also be then a more moderate candidate to sort of unite the party? I mean, Seth, maybe you can go first.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at the leadership of the Democratic Party right now, between Joe Biden and the presidency, the Democratic Senate leadership, the House leadership with Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer. You basically have a lot of people in their late 70s. A lot of people who are very close to retirement age, are probably going to be replaced in the not terribly distant future by people who are much younger and more progressive. The people who have entered politics on the Democratic side in recent years tend to be much further to the left, and they're younger. So certainly the energy of the Democratic Party is toward, I think, toward a more progressive activist base that still recognizes a need to moderate to win in a number of elections, but we're really seeing kind of a in many ways, kind of the last gasps of kind of a moderate Democratic Party that is kind of aging out of power right now.
Elizabeth, anything to add on that?
Well, I'm just thinking, what's that old expression? Seth would know this. Is it that Republicans are the ones that fall in love and Democrats are the ones that fall in line? Do you know that expression?
I think it used to be the opposite. It used
or is
to be
it the opposite?
Yeah.
Because I feel lately, I mean, obviously Democrats want to have someone that they fall in love with, but there's been so much calculated. I mean, you were kind of referring to this, Seth, when you're talking about Joe Biden wasn't everybody's choice in the primary. There's an extremely calculated thing that a lot of Democrats do, which is say, well, it's a little bit like the mother-in-law test, like, well, I think they're okay, but I think my mother-in-law would be really impressed. This idea that you're picking your candidate, not just for who you want, but you're thinking who would work for my Republican neighbor. I think there's very much a consciousness about that. That's why you're seeing things like certain these up and coming candidates where they maybe have a military background. They could be a Democrat who's maybe served for years in the military and can speak that language. They may be a Democrat that's from an extremely rural area and can speak that language. So I think Democrats are kind of looking for that. They're very conscious that, yes, we have this progressive agenda and the whole party has gotten more progressive. It wasn't that long ago. I mean, I'm old enough now to remember when it was big news that Joe Biden came out and supported gay marriage when Obama wasn't really ready to yet. Now that seems kind of quaint. Now, it seems like we've moved so much on this debate, as we have on many issues. And I think a lot of Democrats, they're thinking to themselves, I know my message, I know, where I am, but how can I make it, palpable to my neighbor? How can I make it so they also, what messaging should I use so that they will also like this person? So I think, I don't really have the answer of who are these candidates going to be. It's easier with the Republicans to think it's going to be these 5 or 6 that definitely will run. But I just know it's going to have to be the kind of person that can package their message in a way that also works for undecided voters, of which we have a lot. Let's not forget that, as well as Republicans.
Yes, because what you talked about, Seth, is more a move towards a progressive future, whereas I was going to ask you, is it possible for the Democratic Party to attract some of the moderate voters of the Republican Party who might not actually agree with the Trumpism or the right move of that party? Or do you not see the party going in that way?
I mean, it's interesting. That was one of the real questions for the Democrats going into the 2020 presidential race. They were heavily focused on, the voters that they lost. That there were this set of voters people who had voted for Obama twice and then did not vote for Hillary Clinton. Some of them had gone off and voted for Donald Trump. Some of them had simply stopped voting in 2016. And those were different sets of people. Ideally, Democrats wanted to win back both groups. But some of them were, more moderate to conservative, older white voters. Some of them were younger voters of color who had just sort of felt disenchanted and weren't inspired the same way they were for Barack Obama. They had some success in winning back both. But one of the main reasons that a lot of Democrats rallied around Joe Biden is they saw him as key to winning back some of those quote unquote working class white voters. This is, very much what Elizabeth was talking about. There's this Democrats really get in their own heads in this idea of what electability looks like, what an electable candidate is. That is, they're not just thinking about who they like; they're also judging like who will some not well-educated voter in Wisconsin also like. And there's a lot of just guesses and stereotypes that are built into that. But it is something that Democrats are focused on in a way that in many ways Republicans are not these days. But at least so far, it looks like Biden did make some inroads in that area in the election. He did win back some of the white voters that Hillary Clinton had not been able to win in 2016. Interestingly, he maybe did not do quite as well among some non-white populations as even Hillary Clinton did. So there's been a little bit of shifting around in the election, but overall, Biden seems to have made up a little bit of the ground for Democrats, certainly enough to get elected.
Elizabeth, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I would definitely agree with that there. There was a consciousness when we picked Joe Biden. I think people were thinking of the blue wall. They were thinking of those Midwestern states. They were thinking of Wisconsin and all the losses from Hillary and how could we gain this back? So yeah, I mean that really was there. How can we, the Democratic Party, pick the candidate that works for white working class voters, which is, if this was a question from 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, that would be sort of an absurd question. That was sort of obvious that the Democratic candidate would appeal to that group.
And talking about the future of the party, and someone that we mentioned in the beginning, the role of Kamala Harris, and is she the crown prince of the party, and what is the implication of her being vice president? Maybe Elizabeth can ask you to go first.
I find it so interesting that people are so divided about her. And I'm sure Seth has seen these numbers too, that basically half of people, love her and the other half don't. There's a lot of both very, very positive feelings, people that just feel so inspired and, watched the inauguration with their daughters and had tears in their eyes and just have been incredibly hanging on her every word. I mean, she's really inspired so much more enthusiasm than any recent vice president has. But yet you have these other people that are more negative to her. I think we have to sort of see what comes with her. I'm almost surprised she's we haven't heard more from her the last couple of weeks. I'm sure she's out there doing things, but there was kind of an expectation from a lot of Democrats that she might be a little bit more of a co-president just because of her future role in the party, and Biden's age. And there were sort of rumors. I mean, again, this is speculation that she would more take care of domestic policy while he takes care of foreign policy. But it remains to be seen. But there has been a lot of enthusiasm for her, and it's expected, although it's too early to say, that she'll take on a greater role than previous vice presidents. And we also have to remember her boss used to be vice president. So you know how it is when your boss has that role you now have, they kind of are sympathetic too, to I know what it's like, this role isn't easy. I'm going to make sure that, you get to play an active role because I know what it's like to be vice president. So it doesn't become sort of like the show Veep, where you're kind of off in the corner somewhere.
And Seth, what would you say is her role in the party? Or
Harris is a fascinating figure to me. I was following her a lot in 2019. I saw her as someone who was in many ways seemed to be likely to win the Democratic nomination at that point, in the sense that she was going around the country and impressing a lot of Democratic activists. There were a lot of people who were willing to endorse her fairly early on. They were donating to her campaign. They were impressed that she had the ability to win elections, that she cared about the things that a lot of Democrats care about. And there are, a fair number of Democrats who simply want to see a woman, want to see a person of color in the White House, and saw in her, a lot of intellect. All these things seem to be working for her until they weren't. Her campaign started to fall apart in late 2019. And she very interestingly withdrew at a point where she could have fought longer. But she chose to basically not go on the attack against Joe Biden, the front runner at that point. That looks like a very wise decision going forward. Today, I would say, she probably has a better chance of becoming president than almost any vice president we've had in history. Just given Joe Biden's age, given their partnership, it's not unreasonable to think that Biden might not run for a second term, and that he might simply encourage everyone in the party to rally behind her as his successor. That's certainly a possibility. If he does go a second term, she would certainly be his sort of designated successor after that. But Elizabeth is right. She is a more polarizing figure than Joe Biden is, and that's not necessarily due to to any particular stances she's taken or policies she's advocates. I mean, a lot of that is just simply who she is. As a woman of color, that is just inherently more polarizing in U.S. politics. There are some people who, even though they might not say it, dislike her because she's a woman, dislike her because she's non-white. There are others who are less comfortable with her as the Democratic nominee because they're worried that other people don't like her. Again, that sort of concept of I like her, but is she electable? So there are all those questions, but my impression is she would do about as well in elections as Biden would. And she's a pretty formidable presence, and I think we will be seeing a lot of her. She in the over the next few years. That she'll obviously she has a very prominent role to play in the Senate, which is tied at 50-50. And I think Biden will be continuing to rely on her advice, and in some ways, as Elizabeth noted, making her somewhat of a co-president on a number of issues.
I'm going to come back to Jan's questions in a little bit, but we have received a lot of questions about foreign politics, so I think I will give them to all three of you, whoever would like to answer. One question is, in just 3 months, the US will, according to the peace treaty with the Afghan government and the Taliban, withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. There is a risk that if the US withdraws, the Taliban will take over the power. How do you think President Biden will handle this dilemma? Who would like to go first? Jan, maybe you would like to say something.
I can say something since that's my specialty, security policy. I don't think they will withdraw on May 1st. I think the administration will try to find some kind of diplomatic deal where they can stay maybe 6 months further and try to get a better diplomatic solution. But I think that will be a fool's errand, because it's going to be extremely difficult to negotiate with the Taliban because they are so strong now. So this will be a very difficult problem for Biden to handle. But I think they will try to kick the can down the road a little bit, because as it is now, if the US leaves on May 1st, the government in Kabul might collapse in the near future, I think.
I do have another question on MENA policies. I'm going to throw that in as well. How do you see US Middle East policies changing? We already see change with regards to Saudi Arabia, at least in words, but beyond that, Kurdish issue has already created friction with Turkey. Bibi Netanyahu is waiting for Biden's call, etc. What about the changing of policies towards the Middle Eastern region? Jan, maybe you want to answer that too.
That's another of those really simple ones, huh? The United States in the longer term wants to disengage to some extent from the Middle East. I think that the Abraham Accords between Israel and some of the Arab states are some steps on that road. And I think Mr. Biden wants to continue those. He will be more careful in his relations with Saudi Arabia and Egypt. He will be more careful about human rights than the Trump administration has been. And he will not bank on those dictators that as Trump did. But the two big problems, of course, are the presences in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's going to be difficult for Biden to find a way there. But over time, I think a slow disengagement where the US will try to rely more on its allies in the region rather than be so very active as it has been during the last 20 years. And
this is a trade question. And when it comes to trade, I think that the policies, well, This is going to be up to you to answer, but I will read the question. President Trump ended nearly 25 years of the North American Free Trade Agreement, the trade pact linking US, Canada, and Mexico. Will the new administration renegotiate a new agreement, do you think? Maybe Elizabeth, would you like to comment on this trade question?
That's a good question. I hadn't thought about that. I can't really say. But again, I think I want to lift up that point I made earlier, again, about this Buy America thing, because it is also a departure from the Biden we saw in the Senate and his, I mean, if you look at previous statements he's made about trade, and you see, speaking of what Seth talked about the evolution of the party, you're seeing an evolution in Biden's own words and thinking, where some of it actually, you see a little bit of a reflection on Trump's policies as well, when it comes to that sort of pro-US stance.
Seth, would you like to comment on any of these foreign political issues?
Just a little bit on that last point about North American free trade. One of the priorities that Donald Trump seemed to have in the presidency is basically he wanted to undo a lot of things that he associated with President Obama. So one was simply coming up with some new trade policy in North America. What came out of that was something that actually didn't look very different from what had existed before. It looked very similar to NAFTA. So my guess is substantively, the Biden team doesn't see much of a need to actually renegotiate that. I would doubt there would be substantial changes along those lines. But maybe just another attempt to sort of rebrand. But I don't know if there'd be like substantively a lot of major changes there.
All right. We do have some more questions on Iran, and I would also just want to recommend all of our viewers who are interested in knowing more about the foreign policies of this administration to watch our previous webinar that we did in December following the election, where we actually talked about foreign policies. So that is available on our website if you would like to know more. Maybe I'll turn back to Jan's question. To what extent is this system reformable? What would you say, Elizabeth?
Well, I think we have to sort of work within the system that we have. Unfortunately, there's a lot that is very frustrating to a lot of people. And that frustration includes our whole electoral college system that, like we were mentioning, you can win the popular vote, but not win what we call gerrymandering, which is when you kind of structure a district so that it can very much favor one party over the other. So many things about it. I mean, even just the whole process of running for office and who can run for office and who we see winning these things. There's so much that needs to be changed, but ultimately I think, and when we have our election day, I mean, just the fact that we have it, there's a lot of calls for should it even be on a Tuesday. I'm one of those people who thinks, I mean, some things can be changed, but we have to kind of work within the system. I think there's a lot of just, it's not as easy as it is in Sweden. I think to change laws and change constitutions in Sweden, it's a little bit of an easier process than trying to do it in the US.
Seth, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I would say a lot of the electoral forms we're talking about at the national level would require in some ways constitutional amendments. It is very difficult to see a constitutional amendment passing in the current political environment on almost any topic, just given how polarized the parties are these days. That being said, there is a lot of innovation going on right now within US states. A number of states have reformed their redistricting systems. They are, traditionally, it is state legislatures that change the district borders every 10 years. They do so often in a very partisan way. And a lot of states, including Colorado, where I am now, have put together independent redistricting commissions, where essentially you have an independent or bipartisan group of citizens who draw up these districts. There's a number of states that have put forward a number of voting reforms. They have same-day registration, or allow people to switch parties, or just, they have reduced the barriers for people to participate in elections. There's even some state level innovations going on related to the Electoral College. There is a national voter compact that is working its way around a number of state legislatures, in which state legislatures are forming this compact to agree that whichever candidate wins the popular vote, they will send their electors to that candidate. This could become, there could be enough states signing on to this by 2024. Now, I'm not entirely sure this is constitutional. This could create a real mess in the next presidential election, but it's at least forcing some sort of a conversation about electoral college reform. That being said, there are also some states who are working in the other directions on these things. There are some states currently trying to make it harder to vote. And so you have states marching in very different directions and, on something that honestly really should be a national level reform. So I'm honestly not expecting a lot of innovation at the federal level right now, but at least at the states, there's a fair amount of innovation going on, and at least, some experimentation where we'll, with the political system by the next presidential election, I think will look substantially different from how it looks today.
And I know that this is a question that engages Swedish people, because we have discussed this previously many times about reforming the system of making sure that the majority votes are represented. I'm going to bring this out now to more of a general discussion. This is not particularly for the Democratic Party, but I have a question from the audience. Do you think that Biden's presidency will make people in general forget about Trump if the general feeling of normal politics again gets comfortable and feels more professional? Or do you think Trump can be a person we will have to live with? Elizabeth.
I like to look at the example of Rudy Giuliani, because this was a character that, was one of the most admired Republican figures that we had, New York's mayor during 9/11, and he launched his own presidential campaign and was seen as this promising figure. And then now, years later, he's kind of, by many, considered a little bit of a, not a serious figure. And it just shows how the political winds of change can happen. That 1 minute you are, a potential interesting figure, an exciting figure for your party. 10, 15 years down the road, you can just be the kind of guy that shows up on the cable news shows. We might see that with Trump. We might see that his role, depending on how much media he does in the next few years, where his role becomes the talking head on TV that says outrageous things, and we, in that sense, all forget about him, and he does just become a colorful blip in the party. That's one path that it could take. The other is that what we saw in the Capitol is an indication that there is just a political mindset in this country that supports candidates like Trump, that he could come back, that people like him could come back. Many of his family members are very seriously going to be running for office in various ways. So it could really take both ways. I look at that when you're wondering, could he be forgotten? I think of the Rudy Giuliani example, because of course, Rudy Giuliani is still around, but he's around in a different role than he once could have been as a serious political figure that he once was.
Seth, what are your thoughts about the new normalcy?
I hope Elizabeth is right. I don't know for what. It's interesting to think about what Trump's role might be. One of the things that has really struck me is that Donald Trump has essentially been silent for more than a month now. That is, he was removed from Twitter. Of course, presidents and former presidents have many other ways to speak to the public, through the media or through other statements, and he largely hasn't said anything. That being said, there are a lot of elected Republicans, a lot of Republican Party leaders at the state and national level who are clearly still very loyal to him and very enthusiastically back him. And I think a lot of them see him as key to producing this turnout among working class white voters that other politicians simply can't do. That when he's on a ballot, those people show up. And they on one level, they want that. They want to have that kind of turnout there. And also they don't want to make those voters angry by turning against Donald Trump or by treating him as irrelevant. So, all this is making Trump an ongoing influential figure within the Republican Party, even while he's been quiet, even now that he's out of office. Additionally, since the November election, Donald Trump engaged in a very big fundraising campaign. I mean, he claimed it was to help, mount his legal campaign to overturn the election, but he still raised something like $250 million that he can use to influence Republican primaries next year in congressional primaries. So he will have the ability to reward candidates who were loyal to him. He will have the ability to punish candidates who he didn't see as loyal to him. And, even if he's not considering himself a likely presidential candidate in 2024, he still stands to have a very big influence on his party. But I think if he does decide to run for president, there's still a decent chance he becomes its presidential nominee in 2024. It's not clear to me that Republicans learned the lessons from 2016 about how Donald Trump became their nominee, that a lot of the party's leaders were not comfortable with him at that time, but they weren't able to sort of coordinate around an alternative to Donald Trump. At this point, it's not clear to me who that alternative would be, who is willing to run against Donald Trump in 2024. So I think he's quiet for now. I think we're seeing a lot of professionalism from the Biden administration. I think as the coronavirus seems to be receding for now, as vaccines are getting put out there, I think there's a very good chance that there will be some sort of return to more normal politics, at least in 2021, and perhaps a stronger economy coming out of this year. But Trump remains this very influential force. And as long as we have in the U.S. a two-party system, and one of those parties is heavily influenced by him, he's going to have, I think, a major influence on U.S. politics for the foreseeable future.
All right, so I'm going to try to round this off with a question of mine and also one from a viewer, and then we'll see if we end on a happy note or not, depending on your answer. What are the prospects of the administration's politics and the actual promise in the inauguration to unite the country? And a viewer wants to know, some 70 million people voted for Trump. What can be the message to those people from the Biden administration? Elizabeth, would you like to go first?
Well, I'm optimistic. I think that Biden has the right idea, that he's reached out a hand, that he made it such a big theme of the inauguration. It's really easy to be like, yeah, I won, I'm just going to, push my agenda forward. That he wants to make it work. And there are those issues, like I talked about before, that the two sides can agree on, whether we're talking about jobs, economy, COVID. Another interesting point where they say both sides, when you ask them, what is something that, what are our priorities? Both sides say they want to improve the political situation. That comes back to what we were talking about before. I think there's a lot of reforms that maybe can happen. We'll see how. A climate of dialogue and debate we need to improve. And I think everybody wants to see that. And if Biden is leading that charge and, like Seth was saying, really acting professional and careful about how he does it, I think there's great potential to do this. It's very obvious that it's not about his ego. As we've seen compared to previous presidents, he's not doing this for that reason. He's doing it to bring the country together. And that's, just the intention is important enough. If you have the intention to bring the country together, your chances of succeeding are higher.
Jan, do you have any comments on this?
I tend to be a little bit more pessimistic than Elizabeth. I think that it is going to be difficult to carry out more than one or two of these large reforms. And I think then there is a risk that the electorate will be disappointed. And I think this is a problem that the US political system has lived with for a long time. And unfortunately, I think it will continue.
All right, so then up to you, Seth. Are we going to end this webinar on a happy note or not?
I probably lean a little more pessimistic, but it's interesting that there's been so much conversation about whether Joe Biden can unite the country, and I think a lot of people hear different things in the word unite and have their own definitions of it. I don't think Joe Biden expects everyone to agree with him. I don't think he would even think that would be a good thing. But I think his idea is to have some sort of sense of common purpose, that there's some sort of common mission that the U.S. is pushing toward, even if there are disagreements about how to approach it. It's interesting. There was a poll that recently came out, just basic presidential approval poll. Joe Biden has been doing pretty well in presidential approval so far. He's been averaging around 60% approval. That's substantially higher than Donald Trump ever had. But if you look at the breakdown in there by party, he had a 90% approval rating among Democrats, an 11% approval rating among Republicans. So that's an 87-point gap between the parties. That's the largest we've ever seen in the history of polling in the United States. And that's not really about Joe Biden specifically. Prior to him, the most polarizing president was Donald Trump. Prior to Trump, the most polarizing president was Obama. This has been a longstanding pattern in U.S. politics where the population is simply getting more polarized and the parties stand for just much more different things. So I think his ability to actually win over many Republicans, I think is very limited. I think, we have in some ways a very unstable issue in that we have what is a stable two-party system with very divergent parties who have very different views about even the function of government right now, and the legitimacy of elections. That said, what we're seeing from Joe Biden's approach so far seems to be pretty solid. He's just focusing on administrative competence, on getting vaccines to as many people as possible, on growing the economy. He just seems to be focusing on broadly popular missions. And so far, at least as far as we can tell from public opinion polls so far, most American people are rewarding him for that. He's not going to win everyone over. But if he ends out this year in a fairly popular position with similar approval ratings to what he has now, that might help lower the temperature in American politics somewhat, and allow for something like a more normal politics to return.
That will be the final word. Thank you so much, Seth Maskett, Elizabeth Valentin, and Jan Hallenberg for sharing all this knowledge with us. Thank you to all the viewers for all the questions that you sent us and for watching this webinar. And thank you, Hedvig and Julia, for being the technical masters behind the scenes. If you are interested in knowing more about the Republican Party, we are doing a webinar on Monday evening, the 22nd of February. And on the 19th of March, we will also be discussing the state of democracy in the US. So welcome back for that. Thank you so much, everyone, for tonight, and goodbye.
Thank you.